I'm Deanne Erdman with Baylor College of Medicine's Options Program, and this is a review for the Life Science Teacher Certification exam. All vertebrates share the same basic body plan. I'm going to concentrate on the human today, which when you're working with students is always more interesting to them because they can more easily relate to it. In fact, sometimes you even have to shut down some of the stories that you'll hear about an aunt or a grandmother or some ache and pain that they feel. So they really do make those connections. But as you're going through this particular system, be sure that you always relate it back to the vertebrates and bring in those connections because that reinforces the learning. Let's look at the levels of organization in the body. And the best place to start is with the cell. And with the cell, we all start out as one single cell, which begins to divide. It's undifferentiated for a long period of time. And once it begins to differentiate, it goes into 3 germ layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Those in turn will eventually differentiate into numbers of tissue. But all the different tissues in the body can still be grouped into one of 4 categories. That's epithelial, muscle, nervous, and connective tissues. So cells are groups, are the basic unit of organization in the body, and tissues are groups of similar cells with a similar function. Now, if we look at the next level after tissues, if we take different tissues with the same function, then we put them together into what we call organs. And we have a lot of examples: the heart, the lung, the stomach, but the small intestine, the heart. And when you look at one of these organs individually, you'll see it's made of lots of different tissues: epithelial, covering and lining, muscle tissue, blood vessel tissue, nerve tissue, fat, well, hopefully not too much of that. And those all work together for the same function. Then if we take a number of different organs and join them together with a similar function, that forms an organ system. And you have the muscle, the nervous, the digestive system. And in the case of the digestive system, if we had the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine, they all function together for the process of digestion. Let's look individually at the different tissues of the body. Epithelial tissue is a covering or lining tissue. So the skin is an epithelial tissue, and the lining, the mouth is epithelial, the surface of the stomach, the inside of the stomach, inside of blood vessels are all covered with epithelial tissue. So if you stop and think about it, in order for anything to pass in or out of the body, it has to pass through a layer of epithelial tissue. The next one is connective tissue. Connective tissue is really kind of an unusual group. In this group, bone, fat, cartilage, and blood are all connective tissues. And you might say, well, what could those all have in common? And what they are is unique cells with an extracellular material of some kind. And we call this extracellular material the matrix. And in the case of blood, the cells float in a matrix that is fluid. In the case of cartilage, it's a collagen-based matrix that's somewhat flexible. And in the case of bone, it's a hard calcified matrix. So the tissues, while they seem very different, they still have a similar type construction. Muscle tissue, we have 3 kinds of muscle tissue in the body: smooth, skeletal, and cardiac muscle. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more depth in a later slide. And finally, nerve tissue. Nerve tissue is made of 2 kinds of cells: neurons and neuroglia. And the neuroglia, what they are supporting cells. A good way to begin when you're looking at the organ systems is to stop and take a mental look at this whole list of organ systems. And you may even want to pause watching this for a few minutes and see if you could come up in your mind with sort of a general definition of what you think that system's responsible for, and maybe some of the major parts. And that's a good place to begin. And it's a good place to begin with students and get them thinking about what they really already know. I think you'll find that most students are going to do pretty well with most of these until you get down towards the end, and a lot of them have difficulty really knowing what the endocrine system is and what the integumentary system is. But for the most part, I think they can do pretty well with a starting place on these systems. And it might be something you want to do yourself before you go into the next part of the slides looking at each of the systems in a little bit more depth. The human skeletal system. When you look at us and you look at or ourselves and you look at the skeleton, we're basically the shape of our skeleton. We modify it with a little muscle, maybe a little fat, but we still come out looking basically like the shape of our skeleton. Without it, we would be sort of a big blob, like a giant amoeba, I guess, moving about and blobbing our way through life. So the skeleton gives us a lot of support. Gives us protection. If you take a look, you can see the heart and lungs are protected by the rib cage. The brain is protected by the part of the skull called the cranium, and the spinal cord is protected inside the vertebral column. And finally, storage. Remember that that bone is living, and we have a constant supply of calcium and minerals going in and out of the bone, so it's a reservoir for us, and especially along weight-bearing bones. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of breaking a leg maybe and being on crutches and being non-weight bearing for a while. Part of your recovery process will be, when you start walking on that again, is to recalcify some of those bones, because your body, when you're not putting weight on it, says, oh, we don't need as much calcium, we don't need as much strength in those bones, and we'll pull it out and move it to other places. So just in a short period of time, bones can reorganize, taking things in and out. When you look at the skeleton, the trunk of the body forms the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is sometimes called the upright, not the upper, but the upright portion of the skeleton. And it consists of the skull, the vertebral column, the rib cage, and the sternum. And as we look, of course, in the vertebral column, we have 33 bones, and you have the cervical, which are the neck vertebrae, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, and the coccyx vertebra. The skull is made of the cranium, which protects the brain and the face. And then the rib cage are made of 12 pairs of ribs. The first 7 pair are called true ribs, and the last 5 pair are called false. Of those false ribs, 3 attach directly to the 7th rib, and the last 2 don't attach at all. True ribs actually attach into the sternum. And this is a good place to point out, say, a difference between a human and a snake. In a snake, the ribs don't attach to the sternum in the front at all, and that's an adaptation for feeding, so that it can expand as it swallows its prey whole. We're better served by having a rib cage that comes around and completely joins and gives us that extra protection for the heart. The appendicular skeleton is the attached on portion. So it's the arms, the legs, the hips, and the shoulders. And these are the more movable portions that can go off at all sorts of different angles. If we take the skeleton apart, we could divide the bones into 1 of 4 piles. And they would be the long bones, the flat bones, the short bones, and the irregular bones. And while you can look at a lot of them and tell exactly which pile they might go into, the little finger bones, which are phalanges, and say the long bone of your thigh, the femur, they're both long bones. And so we go by their internal construction, not just their outside appearance. Bone cells, remember, the bone is a living tissue, and inside this hard calcified matrix, we have bone cells called osteocytes. Osteo for bone, cyte for cell. And those are what actually maintain the tissue, the living tissue in the body. When we don't want to forget, when we're talking about the skeleton, about the jointing, because think about if you were just formed rigid with bone and you had no jointing and no ability to move, we would lose a lot of the versatility and flexibility that we need the skeletal system for. So the joints are just as important as the bones themselves, and it's actually the ligaments that hold bones to bone. Don't mix that up with tendon. Tendon binds a muscle onto a bone. A ligament binds bone to bone. Let's take a look at the next slide. And this is a diagram of the skeleton. I don't really think it's necessary for you to memorize all the bones for this particular certification exam, but it doesn't hurt. Something you're going to want to be familiar with. And they're really easy. There's 206 bones altogether, but there's a lot of repeats. All of the finger bones and all of the toe bones are phalanges, so I think you have 52 bones right off the bat that you know the name of. Once again, the most important part of the skeleton is support, and as you look, it's easy to see the upright axial skeleton, and the attached on appendicular skeleton. And don't forget about the joints. As you look at the skeleton, you can see at the arm, where the arm attaches onto the axial skeleton and where the leg attaches, those are ball and socket joints, the most movable joints in the body. At the elbow and the knee, you have hinge joints. The thumb, as it attaches in, is a saddle joint. So you have all different kinds of joints. But with these joints, you can produce numerous movements by putting them in combination with one another. Let's go in and take a look at compact bone. And as you take a look at the bone, you can see these long column-like structures that are inside, and those are called Haversian systems. And the Haversian system is a way that bones are able to get the needed nutrients and get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide and get rid of waste, just like any other cell of the body. Just like if you were encased in a concrete room, you would still have to have some way of getting supplies in and getting supplies out. So needed materials come in through the central canal, and these little tiny canals called canaliculi, materials will move out into the osteocytes, which are kind of the spider-looking little structures. Osteo means bone, cyte means cell. Just because you get this bone all built doesn't mean it stays that way forever. It's constantly reorganized. Cells called osteoclast, C-L-A-S-T, come in and eat away and destroy parts of the bone. They free up the calcium, which can be put back into a new Haversian system or released for use in the body. And after that process, osteoblasts come in and reform. And as they're laying down these new layers or rings called lamellae, after they have the collagen base laid down, then calcium salts are impregnated. And once that happens, the osteoblasts become trapped, they chemically change and become an osteocyte and live in the bone until it might be reorganized at a later time. Let's take a look at the human muscular system. And when we look at the functions, everybody thinks about movement, but primarily you think about external movement. But while we can live with assistance without the external movement, we can't live without the internal movement of fluids and materials throughout the body. So external movement is just as important, if not more important, than the external movement that we're so consciously aware of. When a muscle contracts, it produces heat, and you can tell that if you go out and run a couple of miles, even on a cool day, you can feel all of the extra warmth. Even at rest, your muscle has some contractions going on within it. And that's when you feel the muscle, you can feel some characteristic firmness to the muscle or muscle tone, and that contributes to part of your overall body warmth. And finally, the third function is posture. Not just good, proper posture, but any kind of body position that you get yourself into. One of the first postures you learn is to hold the head up. Think about that big ball that's balanced on a little thin stalk of some narrow vertebral bones, and so you have a lot of muscles that have to pull and coordinate to be able to pull off that balancing act. And you may from time to time look around and see that it looks like maybe some of your students haven't quite mastered that, so you have to keep on them about that. When we look at muscle properties, muscle is very unique in its ability to get shorter, to actually draw together. And it's also unique in that it can be stretched without tearing up the internal cellular structure, and it can respond to stimuli. One thing to remember is that muscles by themselves can only contract, and they do this by muscle proteins sliding between one another. And we're going to look at a slide and demonstrate that in just a few minutes. A muscle cannot push. Now you can create a pushing effect by remaining stationary and having a group of muscles pull the arm straight, say, to push something away from you, but you've just created a pushing effect. A muscle can't push, it can only pull. When we look at the types of muscle that we have in the human body, we have skeletal, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, and we're going to look at those in detail in an upcoming slide. Once again, I don't see a need for you to memorize muscles of the body, but certainly you're going to want to become familiar with some of these terms, because in demonstrating and discussing things with students, you're going to want to talk about that muscles work in antagonistic pairs. That since a muscle can only pull and it can't push, if my biceps muscle pulls my arm up, then my tricep muscle will have to pull my arm straight. So muscles work in opposing pairs. And there are many muscles of the body that do the same thing and work as synergists and work together. Now let's look at the types of muscle tissue. First one is skeletal muscle, and it's kind of unique again as far as a cellular construction because they're long, slender cells, sometimes called fibers, and they're multinucleated. The banding you're going to see comes from the arrangement of the muscle proteins, myosin and actin, within that fiber. You find skeletal muscle attached to the skeleton. They're the ones that we have names for, the trapezius, the pectoralis, the gluteus maximus, gastrocnemius. Those are all skeletal muscles. When we look at smooth muscle is what makes up internal organs. And if you think back to skeletal muscles, we can consciously control skeletal muscles because of the kind of nerve fiber going to it. But smooth muscle, we don't consciously control. We don't consciously contract the stomach to finish digesting that breakfast, and then move it into the small intestine. That occurs on a controlled basis, but not from a conscious level. So we call that involuntary muscle. Also, hormones have a big effect on smooth muscle as well. You find smooth muscle besides the internal organs. Don't forget about the blood vessel. And for people who worry about high blood pressure or lack of blood pressure, that comes from the contraction of that smooth muscle. Even as the light changes in the room and the iris adjusts the amount of light coming in through your pupil, that's done with smooth muscles as well. Cardiac muscle has the banding like skeletal muscle, but like smooth muscle, it's involuntary. It has interbranching fibers and is usually just one nucleus per cell. And these interbranching fibers are part of what give the resiliency to cardiac muscle and allow it to continue to contract, usually 60 to 70 beats per minute, if we're lucky, for a lifetime. Now, how does muscle shorten? Let's look at skeletal muscle, and this is the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. And as you look at the banding is actually created by the arrangement of these myosin and actin fibers. Myosin are the fat fibers, and actin are the thin fibers. And what happens is during contraction, the myosin fibers form little heads or cross bridges that are actually able to bind with the actin and pull together, shortening the whole functional unit, which is called the sarcomere. So the functional unit within this muscle fiber is a sarcomere, and depending on how much stimulation you have to the muscle will depend on how many sarcomeres are contracting and how much actual shortening that you get. Remember that you can't add muscle cells or take away muscle cells. If when you work out and when you condition and you stay in good health and you use the muscles, you maintain a good protein level and you maintain the use of all the sarcomeres within your muscle. Without use, some of the protein is removed and you get where you can't contract as many sarcomeres, and that's called when a muscle atrophies. Let's move to the human circulatory system. And the circulatory system is what I call the mass transit system of the body. We've got all these neat systems out there, the respiratory system and the urinary system, but they're not connected by one another, yet they're performing functions that are necessary for all the cells of the body. So we've got to have some way of pickup and delivery of materials from place to place, and that's the job of the circulatory system. So it transports the nutrients, the gases, the waste, the water, hormones, distributes heat. You think, well, how does it distribute heat? On a very, very cold day, it's going to constrict blood vessels near the surface of the skin and keeping blood deep in the body, conserving and protecting your vital organs. When it's a real warm day, you may even look a little flushed as the blood vessels near the surface of the skin will dilate, bringing more blood closer to the skin, being able to take advantage of that evaporation process that occurs. Let's look at some of the structures of the circulatory system. And in order to have a circulatory system, you need some sort of pump, some sort of fluid, circulating fluid, and some sort of vessels. And humans, of course, have a closed circulatory system, meaning the blood stays within vessels all of the time. This was a pretty significant discovery, actually. In 1628, a man named William Harvey pretty much mapped out that the circulatory system, that the blood flowed in a closed system of vessels. Up until that time, they thought that blood sort of sprang forth from the heart, went out into the tissues, and was used up. It wasn't too unreasonable of a proposition, because without the use of microscopes, you knew how important the blood was. We could see you taking in air and taking in food, and it had to go somewhere, and that must construct blood, which must be used up in the tissues. So it wasn't uncommon for the great physicians of the day to practice bleeding. So that if you were ill, they knew blood was tied up. So if they got rid of some of that bad blood, it might make you feel better, which of course we know now doesn't do much good for you. It ends up, it can actually end up weakening you. An interesting note is that the common man during that time didn't necessarily have access to the great physicians, and so many times the local barber served that purpose. You could get bandaged there, you could have bloodletting if you weren't feeling too well, get your hair cut. And that's why the pole is the color that it is in front of the barber shop. With that in mind, let's take a look at the major structures of the circulatory system. First, the heart. The heart is the pump. Humans have a 4-chambered heart. This is a good time to go back and review and compare with other vertebrate organisms. For example, fish have a 2-chambered heart. Amphibians start out with a 2-chambered heart as a larva, metamorphosize to have a 3-chambered heart. The reptiles, for the most part, have a 3-chambered heart with a partial separation in the ventricle. And birds and mammals have a 4-chambered heart. And the heart is responsible for propelling and circulating the blood throughout the body. The vessels, we have arteries, veins, and capillaries. And arteries take blood away from the heart and in general carry oxygenated blood, with exception of some vessels around the heart. And the veins return blood back to the heart, generally unoxygenated blood, with the exception of some vessels going to and from the heart and lungs. And finally, the capillaries, which is where the actual work and exchange of the circulatory system occurs. I always like to compare the arteries and veins to sort of the freeway. If you were going to stop and buy a loaf of bread, you don't just stop in the middle lane of a highway to do it. You've got to get off on the feeder streets and into the parking lots. And that's what the capillaries do for you. They're the blood vessels that are thin enough, 1 cell thick, have direct contact with the cells of the body, so that these vital exchanges of nutrients, water, hormone, vitamins, oxygen, carbon dioxide can actually take place. As we take a look at the blood, in the blood we have the white blood cells and the red blood cells. Red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. And one of the most important functions of the red blood cell is that it contains hemoglobin, which is a pigment that has a great affinity and attraction for oxygen. In fact, it lets you transport 60 times more oxygen than you would if you just had to wait for oxygen to dissolve into the blood. You might compare this and go back and talk about mollusks, again, in making your connection with vertebrates. Mollusks, the pigment in their blood, is hemocyanin, and that's what picks up the oxygen. It's also what makes the blood of a mollusk actually blue. Our blood's not blue. When you look through your skin and you see the veins looking in kind of a blue tint, that's really a color distortion. Blood in the veins is low in oxygen. It's dark red, kind of blackish in color, but when you look through the pigments of the skin, sometimes you get that bluish cast. The lymphatic system is important because as the blood works into the capillaries, pressure increases, and some of the fluid of the blood, which is called plasma, will leak out into the tissues. Some of that's reabsorbed, but a lot of it is picked up by lymphatic vessels, which return that tissue fluid back into circulation in veins in the neck. And it's important that as that fluid passes back, it passes through lymph nodes where there's a lot of activity of white blood cells to help remove any kind of possible bacteria and viruses and other kinds of pathogens in the body. Let's take a look at the heart. This is a ventral view of the heart, so left and right appear on the opposite sides. This is a traditional view that you're always going to see. It's really two pumps working together. The right side of the heart is going to receive blood from the body. It's going to be low in oxygen. It's going to come in through the superior and inferior vena cava and into the right atrium. It's going to pass through a one-way set of valves called the tricuspid valve. Then the ventricle is going to contract, force blood out through the pulmonary artery and onto the lungs. So this part is called pulmonary circulation. And with pulmonary circulation, we are taking blood back from the body and sending it to the lungs to be oxygenated. Now, in the massive capillary arrangement of the lungs, the flow of blood is slowed down to a point that it would never be able to continue from that point and make it out to the rest of the body. So we bring it back to the other side of the heart, the left side, in through the pulmonary arteries, and we put those into the left atrium, past the mitral valve, another one-way set of doors. The left ventricle contracts. It can't go backwards, so it goes out through a set of semilunar valves, the aorta, and onto the body. The heart is self-initiating in its contraction. There's a bundle of nervous tissue called the sinoatrial node, or SA node, or pacemaker, which initiates the beat of the heart. And that's picked up by the atrioventricular node through the ventricle, the septum in the ventricle, and that's where we get the beat of the heart. It's about 60 to 70 beats per minute, the average human. The brain, or the central nervous system, can speed and slow the heart, but it doesn't initiate that original heartbeat. The heart, of course, is made of cardiac muscle tissue, and that muscle tissue we've already talked about is how resilient that it actually is. The human immune system. The human immune system, sometimes you'll see it still lumped in with the circulatory system, but more commonly now you see it really designed as its own system, because as we learn more about it and really stand in awe of its amazing ability to be able to differentiate between harmful substances that we come in contact with and have a constant barrage of, and non-harmful substances. Kind of a good way to start looking at the immune system is to divide it into non-specific defenses and specific immune responses. And our non-specific defenses include the skin, and the skin, which is the largest organ in the body, by the way, it makes up about 15% of your body weight. This is a big physical barrier. Also provides some chemical protection in the form of oils and sweat and mucus. But the skin and the mucous membranes really do give us a lot of protection. We take it for granted until, remember that one time you get that cut, and all of a sudden, what are you worried about? You're worried about some kind of infection. So that's one of our best and first lines of defense. The inflammatory response begins when some kind of a substance gets in and causes histamines to be released, and local hormones called prostaglandins. It increases circulation to the area, which is going to bring in the white blood cells. And the white blood cells, of course, have the ability to be able to engulf some of these particles and get rid of them. And again, it's nonspecific. They're not really concerned whether it's a bacteria or a virus. It's just that it's not something that it recognizes as okay, not part of the body. Another non-specific defense is to raise temperature. And many of these pathogens do not operate in a temperature range very much above or below that of the human body. So as we raise the temperature, which makes us feel awfully uncomfortable, that also slows down the growth of these organisms and allows our own immune defense systems to get a handle on them a little quicker. Also, we release some proteins such as interferon, and what it does is it's released by the damaged or infected cell, but it protects some of the cells around it and keeps them from being able for the virus or disease-causing organism to infect and be able to replicate. Now, when we go to specific immune responses are able to really custom tailor into a specific disease. And what triggers the specific immune response are what we call antigens. Antigens are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids that are on the surfaces of viruses and bacteria. And the body recognizes these and will go about getting rid of them in several ways. Humoral immunity involves the production of antibodies, and these antibodies are specific. The cells that we have will home in on a specific type of bacteria-specific virus, and they will even create, in some cases, some memory cells to help protect you from that in the future. Many times, these antibodies tag something for destruction, kind of like a beacon going off, calling the white blood cells, the macrophages, in to eliminate them. Cell-mediated immunity involves identifying different cells that are infected, say, with a virus or a bacterial cell, and actually transferring proteins to destroy and rupture that cell. Usually humoral immunity and cell-mediated work in concert with one another. And that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at the immune system, but it gives you just sort of a basic review. When we look at disease prevention in humans, one of the first things that comes to my mind is how we identify pathogens. And of course, Koch's postulates, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur identified that viruses and bacteria, that there were pathogens, that they were causing disease. And Koch's postulates, which are still a foundation of microbiology today, involve first isolating and identifying a pathogen in an unhealthy organism, but not in a healthy organism. Then isolating it and growing it in the lab, and reintroducing it into a healthy organism and having it cause the same disease, and then re-isolating that and having it be the same organism that you had in the beginning. So there's 4 steps to Koch's postulates. Edward Jenner in 1796 discovered the vaccination process. And this is a fairly rare instance where immunity to one specific disease gives you immunity to another. And we're talking about cowpox and smallpox. And he noticed that many people that worked in the dairies had cowpox at one time, which is not nearly deadly like smallpox is, but they seemed to be immune whenever there would be a large smallpox epidemic. And so he had a pretty risky procedure, but what he did was to actually inoculate a young boy with cowpox. When he recovered, then he actually injected smallpox into the young man, and he was protected. So while it was a pretty scary process, it has given us a lot of protection from some very serious kinds of diseases. When we look at different disorders of the immune system, allergies are really kind of a hypersensitive immune system. And what the body is not doing, it's not distinguishing between a true pathogen such as a virus or a bacteria and say something like pollen or mold. And so the body is initiating these immune responses to get rid of these things that really aren't pathogens. And so that's what's going on in an allergy. In an autoimmune disease, what happens is the body doesn't distinguish between disease-causing organisms and its own tissues. An example that comes to mind is a Streptococcus bacteria that causes rheumatic fever. And that particular bacteria will also, as the body tries to develop immunity to that bacteria, it will also attack cardiac muscle tissue because those cells seem similar in some way to the Streptococcus as far as the body's immune response is concerned. So you can cause scarring and damage to the heart if you don't eliminate this particular infection pretty quickly. So autoimmune diseases, some rheumatoid arthritis, lupus are examples of autoimmune diseases. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, you can see from 2 different perspectives. Occasionally there are people born where their immune system is not functioning and it fails to develop, and so you begin to see that you can't even recover from something as simple as a common cold without an immune system. And there have been several famous studies and ongoing research with this particular disorder. And then of course AIDS, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which targets our helper T cells within our immune system, and so it's attacking the very thing that is able to defend you. So a person who succumbs to the AIDS disease really will end up dying from some other kind of pathogen. It's just because their own immune system has shut down. The HIV, it's good to approach this particular topic a number of different places, not just when you're talking about disease, but also when you're talking about viruses and how viruses are actually transmitted, how they replicate, how they're stored, the different kinds of life cycles. So you would want to relate this back to your virus unit as well. The human respiratory system is responsible for getting our oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. And because we're such a complex, multi-celled organism, we have to combine an additional process besides just the respiration portion. We have to add in breathing. We've got to have a mechanism of getting air to a central loading dock where we can get it into the blood, which can efficiently deliver the oxygen and pick up the carbon dioxide from all the cells of the body. So respiration is a gas exchange between an organism and the environment. This is another place that you might want to review and go back and talk about cellular respiration and that process. But we're going to look at the respiratory process of just getting the oxygen into the body and the carbon dioxide out. The respiratory structures that air has to go through to even get to that point is to enter through the mouth or the nose, go through the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, the bronchioles, and finally down into the air sacs called alveoli. And this is where the gas is actually going to first pass through a membrane and into the body, or the gas is going to pass out of the body. And we'll take a look at a diagram of the respiratory system on the next slide. When we want to talk about the mechanism of breathing, the lungs aren't made of muscle. They can't suck air in and out. And so we come back to Boyle's law, that the volume of a given quantity of a gas, if that increases, then the pressure decreases. And so the lungs are contained in an airtight cavity. If we raise the ribs and lower the diaphragm, we've expanded the cavity. And that causes air to lower the pressure, so air rushes in. When we want to exhale, we do just the opposite. We raise the diaphragm and we lower the ribs. The pressure is increased and air rushes out in that particular space. When we look at respiratory diseases, bronchitis, pneumonia, emphysema, different kinds of cancers, and they can be caused by viruses, by bacteria, by smoking, and by different types of harmful pollution. Let's take a look at the human respiratory system, a diagram, and I might mention that a lot of people take it for granted that we're breathing in air, we call it oxygen. Really, there's only about 21% oxygen. If you take a number of rapid breaths in a row, you oxygenate your blood, and you end up having too high a concentration and actually can become a little bit dizzy. It might interest you to know that it's really not the lack of oxygen, but the buildup of carbon dioxide in your body that causes you to inhale again. So the body monitors in the brain the levels of carbon dioxide, and that's what actually triggers the breathing mechanism. As we take a look at this diagram, air is going to go in through the nasal passage, which warms and moistens and filters the air, so it prepares it for use in the lungs. It goes through the pharynx, into the trachea, goes through an opening called the epiglottis, which keeps food and other materials out, passes to the larynx, which is the voice box containing the two vocal cords, goes into the trachea, to the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and finally the alveoli. you can think about the respiratory system as sort of an upside down tree. When you look at a tree from a great distance away, you see the trunk, the main branches, and then you see sort of a green mass. And the respiratory system is sort of the same way. The trachea and primary bronchi are like the brown branches, where the bronchioles and alveoli are like the individual green branches of the tree and the leaves of the tree. So the lung is really not solid like it looks at all. But the alveoli are where the actual gas exchange occurs. The human digestive system its whole function is to break food down or nutrients down to a level that can be used by the cells of the body. And that we have a number of structures involved. We have the gastrointestinal tract, which consists of a tube that passes through the body, and that's the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and large intestine. But we have some important accessory structures that help out this gastrointestinal tract in the teeth, tongue, salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. A nutrient is needed for growth, repair, and maintenance in the body. And the nutrients, of course, that we're talking about, carbohydrates, which we're ultimately going to break down into monosaccharides, and that's our starches and sugars, of course, the carbohydrates. Proteins, which we're going to break down to amino acids. Lipids, which we're going to break down into fatty acids and glycerin. And then you have vitamins and various trace minerals. I think it's a good thing to focus in and talk a lot about nutrition. It's important sometimes to have students chart their diet, their real diet, tell them that this isn't, they're not going to get a better grade because they have a balanced meal, but we want them to actually see what they're eating. And sometimes you wonder why some of them are still alive. But we have a nationwide problem with obesity. We also have some real problems with anorexia nervosa and bulimia. And so discussing good nutrition, proper ways of maintaining weight, and also combining that with exercise, this is an excellent teaching moment, and you don't want to lose this opportunity. The next slide shows us a diagram of the human digestive system, and as you can see, just as we talked about, the mouth, it goes in through the mouth, through the pharynx, down into the esophagus. In the esophagus, this is where peristalsis begins. And peristalsis is the muscular wave-like movement that transports food throughout the 30-some-odd feet of tubing that we have in the digestive system. From there, we go into the stomach. The stomach's primary function is to store and to churn food to a semi-liquid form called chyme. In the stomach, we're going to produce hydrochloric acid, which is necessary to lower the pH so that the enzyme pepsin can begin to digest proteins. From the stomach, where the food is moved into the small intestine, and the small intestine is probably the most important part of the digestive system. This is where the food, the completion of the digestion of the food, the breakdown of the nutrients occurs, and this is also where it's absorbed through the walls and into the bloodstream. And while we already have about 21 feet of intestine, that's not nearly enough surface area. So if you look inside the intestine, you have small folds called villi, and if you look even further on the villi, we have microvilli. So all of that increased folding gives you more surface area for secretion of materials into the intestine to help with digestion and absorption of the materials once they are digested. Then in the small intestine also, the liver is going to add bile that helps to emulsify the fats, which is kind of like a detergent, breaking up droplets of fat so that they can be more easily processed. The pancreas adds multiple enzymes to help with the digestion as well. From the small intestine, we go in through the final tube, and that's the large intestine. And the large intestine does not absorb any digested food product. If it hasn't been absorbed, it's not going to be. Instead, it's responsible for absorbing water and vitamins. The large intestine also maintains a large flora of bacteria that help produce some important vitamins for us and help with the digestive process as well. The human excretory system, and excretion is the removal of a metabolic waste, and that's why you'll notice that we're not really discussing the feces that's removed from the large intestine in this list, because that's not a true metabolic waste. It has not been produced as a result of metabolism. So we're getting rid of toxic chemicals, excess water, carbon dioxide, salts, and heat from the body. And our major excretory organs are the skin, which gets rid of some small amounts of urea, but salts and water. The lungs, which gets rid of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. And then finally the kidneys, which get rid of about 75% of our metabolic waste. Let's concentrate on the kidneys, and we usually just refer to this as the urinary system. And the kidneys, we have two bean-shaped structures. The ureters transport the urine to the urinary bladder where it's stored, and then it exits the body through the urethra. And if you look within the kidney, there are about 1 million filtering units called nephrons. And the way the nephrons function is that the blood, as it enters into the cup-shaped portion of that nephron called Bowman's capsule, it breaks into a knot of capillaries. The pressure increases, squeezing a lot of the fluid of the blood into that tubular portion of the nephron. As the material passes through the nephron, anything that is needed by the body is put back out into the spaces, reabsorbed by the blood, and returned back to circulation. Anything left in the tubule drains to the center of the kidney, down the ureter, to the urinary bladder, and out once again. So the nephrons are really pretty remarkable structures, filtering structures within our kidneys. The human reproductive system. Human reproductive system is a little bit different than our other systems of the body, in that if our respiratory system fails to function or our circulatory system fails to function, then that's pretty much life-ending. And a person can live without the reproductive system functioning, although I will say that if there are hormone imbalances, that can really skew and cause some multiple problems, because the reproductive hormones do affect a lot of the other systems of the body. But the failure for the reproductive system to work and produce an offspring is only significant for us as a species, but not significant for us as an organism and to our survival. The major function of the reproductive system is to produce gametes, or sex cells, and what they are cells that have 1/2 of each of our pairs of chromosomes. The male is going to contribute 1/2, the female is going to contribute 1/2, so no matter how much more you look like one parent than the other, you're still exactly 50-50. When the egg and sperm join, they form a zygote, and from that zygote the cells begin to divide. Now, the rest of the parts of the reproductive system are there to maintain these reproductive cells, to make them possible to join, and then maintain that developing embryo to a point where it can survive out in the cold, cruel world. And I've listed the parts of the male and the female reproductive system, but we're going to look at a diagram of each in just a moment, and we'll go over the functions. But basically, in the male reproductive system, the testes is the primary reproductive structure producing the sperm, or the gamete, the male gamete. And in the female, the ovary is the primary reproductive structure producing the female gamete, or the eggs. If we take a look at the male reproductive system, sperm are produced in the seminiferous tubules within the testes, and the testes is housed outside the body in the scrotum. If the testes were to remain inside the body, the temperature is just a little bit too warm for viable sperm to form, so they have to be outside of the body. From there, they move into the epididymis, which is a 20-foot long coiled tube which serves to store sperm. And it also will go through and improve the fertility of the sperm. It will remove sperm that aren't the right size, aren't the right shape, aren't the right age, and improve the overall fertility of the sperm. From there, the sperm are not motile yet. They're moved by cilia up through the inguinal canal into the vas deferens, which joins the seminal vesicle. Seminal fluid is added at that point, which is going to be the material or the fluid that the sperm can swim in and also provides nutrients for the sperm. They pass through the prostate gland, which is going to rhythmically contract to ejaculate the sperm, and it leaves through the urethra in the process of ejaculation. Now let's take a look and see where the sperm need to go, and that's to the female reproductive system. And as we take a look at her system, the eggs are produced in the ovary. And one difference, when the male is born, the testes don't contain any sperm. They begin producing sperm at puberty, and the hormone testosterone, which helps to regulate those levels. But when the female is born, she contains all of the eggs that she's ever going to produce. She merely matures and releases one of these each month in a process called ovulation, but she cannot replace these eggs if something happens to them. So on a monthly cycle, on a monthly basis called the menstrual cycle, the ovary will mature and release an egg. It breaks through the ovary wall, and it's up to the finger-like projection, the fimbriae, of the fallopian tube to sweep that egg down into that tube. It's in the fallopian tube that the egg can be fertilized, and the egg is only in that tube for about 3 days. But fertilization does occur inside the fallopian tube. So that tells you that the sperm had to, once they were deposited in the vagina during sexual intercourse, had to then make their way through the uterus and into the oviduct for fertilization to take place. If the egg is fertilized, it remains in the oviduct for a period of several cell divisions and arrives as a small ball of cells and implants in the uterus. And the function of the uterus has an inner blood-rich layer called the endometrium, so that wherever the egg might implant, it will be able to form an attachment with the blood vessels of the mother. Ultimately, this forms the placenta. And this gives us an exchange of nutrients. Remember that the baby's blood and the mother's blood don't mix, but the nutrients are exchanged across this important membrane. As we take a look at the human endocrine system, the endocrine system is a system of ductless glands. And so since they don't have a duct or tube that connects them with all of the areas they affect in the body, they have to depend on the circulatory system. And the endocrine system produces hormones. These hormones regulate growth, they regulate development, behavior, reproduction, are just some of the important things that they do. I have a list of the various endocrine glands here, and we're going to look at that on a diagram in a moment. But of course, the hypothalamus and pituitary are your control glands. Hormones are chemical messengers. They travel through the blood, as I said before, because they don't have their own tubing. And what they do is they look for and target what we call target cells. So a hormone, for example, insulin, would not necessarily affect every single organ or cell in the body. It has certain areas that particular hormone is able to affect. The same with adrenaline, the same with testosterone, the same with estrogen, calcitonin, all these different hormones that you have in the body. They have specific target cells and receptor sites that they recognize so that they can affect their change. When we look at the hormones, we have steroid hormones and non-steroidal hormones. The hormones that are steroids are made of lipids from cholesterol, and what they're able to do is once they reach their target cell, they actually pass through the membrane and into the cell to produce their desired effect. The non-steroidal hormones are amino acid based, and they remain on the outside of the cell and activate a second messenger within the cell. This is just a little location of the different endocrine glands in the body. You can see the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and that's an important connection because the endocrine system, if it's controlling a lot of these activities, that's a lot of what the nervous system does as well. So they need to be able to coordinate, and that's where that happens. You have the thyroid gland, which is important for growth and metabolism, the parathyroid, which is involved in calcium regulation, thymus gland is involved with immunity, adrenal gland, our stress response, pancreas, glucose regulation and levels, and of course the ovary and the testes are important for gametes production. It's very important to remember that the endocrine system plays a vital role, along with the nervous system, in homeostasis, in maintaining that steady state within the body. The human nervous system. The human nervous system gathers information, processes, and sends out commands, and in general is trying to coordinate all of these activities of the body and keep up with what's going on and diffuse out signals that aren't particularly important at that particular moment. So it controls and coordinates functions throughout the body. Neurons are the specialized cells within the human nervous system, and we'll look at a diagram of one of those in a minute and talk about a little bit about the transmission of electronic impulses. The other cells we mentioned earlier in the nervous system are neuroglia, which are supporting cells within the nervous system. The major kinds of neurons we have: motor nerves, which send signals out from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord; sensory nerves, which bring them back into the central nervous system; and association neurons, which you find in the central nervous system, in the brain and in the spinal cord. As we look at the nervous system, the central nervous system, as I said, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and all of the myriad of nerve networks that go out to all parts and all areas of the body. The peripheral nervous system we divide into somatic and autonomic. Somatic is what we have conscious control of. Autonomic is what occurs on an involuntary basis. And the autonomic is further divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is probably what's going on in your body right now: normal breathing rate, normal heart rate, normal adrenaline levels. But if something causes an emergency reaction, the parasympathetic portion, the sympathetic portion takes over and puts you into emergency reactions, so that you are using all systems to your best advantage for survival. This is a diagram of a general neuron. There are a number of different kinds of neurons, but this is a pretty typical one that you'll see. Impulses come in through the dendrites, the cell body, and out through the axon. They're one way only. The neuron either sends a signal or it doesn't. It doesn't send like a weak signal one time and a strong signal the other time. It's all or none. And the electrical before we talk about the electrical activity, let's just look at the general structure. The dendrites are reaching out and making connections with other neurons, and the axon at the end, the axon terminals, are making contact with other neurons. And these connection points are called synapses, and there is actually a gap. And in these synapses, neurotransmitters have to be produced in order for the impulse to be able to travel on. When you look at a resting nerve, there is a relative concentration of sodium ions. So when you look at the relative concentration of sodium ions, and it makes the resting neuron more chemically positive on the outside of the membrane from the inside of the membrane. And when you have a disturbance in the membrane or disturbance in the action potential, you cause voltage channels to open, and that particular place becomes, the polarity reverses, and it becomes temporarily more negative on the outside. And as that disturbance in the action potential passes down the length of the nerve, that's what we transmit as an impulse. When you look at this particular nerve, it has a myelin sheath, which is an insulating factor and speeds up the transmission of the electric impulse. And the nodes of Ranvier also, those little gaps, the impulse will jump, and that actually speeds up the transmission of the nerve fiber as well. When we look at the human brain, remember that the brain is protected inside a part of the skull called the cranium. There are three membranes called the meninges. And you may have remember that term when you hear about a disease, meningitis. And meningitis is pretty severe because it's an infection of these membranes in direct contact with the brain or with the spinal cord. The three big parts of the brain we want to talk about: the cerebrum, which is involved in memory, insight, intelligence, judgment. The senses are interpreted. The folding increases the surface area and the amount of area there are for these neural connections and neural networks. The cerebellum is involved in muscle coordination and coordination of activities in the body. And then the midbrain, what it's important in is relaying messages, screening out messages. If you were aware of every single thing coming in from all over the inside of your body, outside of your body, and everything happening around, you would just be a disoriented mess. So the brain screens out signals that aren't important and makes you aware of the things that you need to be concentrating on. So it's important in relaying messages. The midbrain is also important in homeostasis, in maintaining homeostasis in the body, heartbeat, respiration rate, etc. The integumentary system, we mentioned before that the skin is the largest organ in the body, makes up about 15% of your body weight. It's your first line of defense, and it consists of the skin, the hair, and the nails. The skin, the epidermis, is the outside. It's really real thin, about like a sheet of paper, and it's the outer surface. Dermis, which is made of blood and nerves and sense receptors and hairs, is a much thicker layer, and it's what you find below the epidermis. Then the next layer is the subcutaneous tissue, which is important in insulation and protection. And then finally, the hair and the nails, which are filled with keratin, and they protect and insulate as well. Homeostasis, we've been talking about different forms of homeostasis all throughout this particular talk, and what homeostasis involves is regulating the internal environment, producing a steady state. And that's what homeostasis is a controlled, stable, internal environment. And just by the act of taking in oxygen, carbon dioxide going into the blood, you have immediate chemistry changes that have to be rectified, or the blood's not going to function correctly. And if it's not functioning right, then cells aren't getting what they need. So continually, with every single thing we do, there is a struggle to come back to that steady state or to that homeostasis. And we have control systems, receptors, control centers, effectors that monitor various places in the body. We have different feedback loops. A lot of homeostatic mechanisms work on a negative feedback system. Let's take, for example, testosterone in the male. When the testes begins to produce testosterone, the level, the pituitary gland actually stimulates that. The level begins to build to a certain normal level. Sperm production increases to a certain level. When that gets to a correct point, the testosterone itself inhibits any more of its own production until that level drops. And then as soon as it drops, it starts up again. So that's a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop might be, say, during childbirth. The hormones that are involved in the contraction of the uterus intensify, and as one contraction gets stronger, they continue to get stronger and stronger until ultimately you achieve your goal, which is the birth of the baby. And that pretty much brings us to the end of our talk, or in the case of a newborn, the beginning. Thank you very much.